What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another Swift video. In today's video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look as to how to pass data between one or multiple view controllers. So pretty popular, pretty heavily requested, so I figured we'd do a deep dive of the three most common ways. So here's the app we're going to be putting together. Each of these tabs has some type of method of passing data. In this first tab here, we pass in via an initializer data into the second controller with the selected item and the related items. So we're going to take a look at this approach. The second approach is getting data from one controller back to the other via a closure. So here we have a label on a button. We can hit this and type in some text. And when we hit done, we pass it back to this controller and update this label. And the third one is a way of passing data based on an event to all the observers. So when we hit this button, we actually pass the color red to this controller and this controller, and we also tell this controller to get rid of its table. So three different approaches. All three are the absolute most common ways to do it in 99.999% of apps, and we're going to look at each one in depth and talk about pros and cons. So that said, make sure you start off by destroying that like button down below so YouTube has to go back and fix that button. Helps out the video quite a bit. If you're a returning viewer, hit subscribe, get excited, get pumped, open up Xcode, and let's dive into it. Quick pause before we get into the video. If you haven't seen it already, I am hard at work putting together iOSacademy.io, a community where all of us iOS engineers can come together, learn how to build some of the top apps like Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, in addition to interview prep to land some of these iOS roles at top tech companies. So if you're interested in the free and premium content to come, head on over to iOSacademy.io and enter your email address in the waitlist form, and you will be notified as content becomes available. That said, let's get into the video. All right, so let's go ahead and get started by opening up Xcode and creating a new project. I'm going to stick with a single view application here. And let's go ahead and call this project Passing Data Between VCs. Make sure your language is set to Swift. Make sure your lifecycle is UIKit and interface is Storyboard. If it is Swift UI, you are going to get different files, so it'll be tricky to follow along. So make sure all of that is set. Go ahead and save your project. And before we start writing any of our own code, let's go ahead and pick a simulator up here. I'll go with the 8. Hit that run button to build and launch your simulator. That way it'll be nice and ready when we start adding our own code, which we'll do in a quick second here. Wait for it to boot up. That's not the one we want. Let's go ahead and close that one. This should be the one we want. And while that boots up, let's go ahead and go to our view controller. So as you saw in the beginning of the video, we're going to take a look at three different ways to pass data between view controllers. And let me just list them out here really quickly so we get a kind of a bird's eye view of what we're going to be covering. So the first thing we're going to do, let's get rid of that. The first one we're going to do is a custom initializer. The second one we'll do is a completion handler or a closure. And the third one we're going to do is a notification center post. So each of these have distinct trade-offs and advantages and disadvantages, and we'll talk about those briefly as we go from one to the next. So cool, custom initializer. So this one's pretty common and pretty easy to set up. And the idea of this is you create another view controller, obviously, that you want to pass data to, and you give it a custom initializer with your own parameters that you must use to pass in the given data. So what does that even mean? So let's get started first and foremost by creating a basic table view on our first controller here that the template gave us. And we're going to select a cell in here, and based on that, we're going to open another controller. So we're going to create the table with the anonymous closure pattern here. If you're not familiar with this, go ahead and just follow along. And afterwards, I've got a separate video entirely dedicated to this, so take a look at that. So here we're registering a cell that we can use. We're going to add this table as a sub view. We're going to say add sub view for the table. We're going to set its delegate and set its data source. And we need to conform to those respective protocols so it doesn't complain. So UI table view delegate, UI table view data source. And finally, we need 3 functions. So number of rows, let's go ahead and say 20. Cell for row we need, and in here we want to dequeue a cell. So we're going to dequeue a cell with the ID we registered for index path. Go ahead and return the cell. And let's just go ahead and set some random label on here. We'll just say hello and add in the current row position. We do +1 since the rows start at 0. And the last one we want is here, and here is did select row at index path. Firstly, we're going to deselect the row, aka unhighlight it. And let's go ahead and just hit Command R and make sure our table view is appearing. Actually, there's one thing I forgot to do. Make sure you assign the table a frame. And we're going to say view.bounds. And that'll ensure the table takes up the entirety of the screen like so. Also, I'm going to go ahead and hit Command-Shift-A, which will put the simulator into dark mode since it's a little easier to see. So cool. So we've got this table here, and we can select the cells, looking good. Let's bring in another view controller we want to pass data into. So let's right-click this and hit New File. We're going to go and select a Cocoa Touch class right here. And it's going to be a subclass of a UI view controller. And I'm going to call this second custom view controller. No need to check this nib file box. Go ahead and hit enter twice to create it. And let's go ahead and get rid of this commented code. Let me go ahead and give this a title of custom controller. And basically, whenever we tap on, let me actually move this up. Whenever we tap on any of these cells, we want to create this custom controller. So how do you create a controller? So we can simply say let VC, which stands for view controller, name of the controller, parentheses to create it. And we can simply go ahead and say present VC animated true. So now if you go ahead and hit run, and if we click on any of these, you see we get this other controller popping up. The reason you don't actually see it is because there's no background color set on it. So let me go ahead and give its view a background color so we can see it. And let me go with system green. Get some nice colors in here. So we click on this now, we see the green controller popping up in a modal fashion. But what we want to do and what we care about is passing data in here. So before we can do that, we need to actually set up some data here. So in our first controller, let's go ahead and simply create an array of some items. So let's say private let data is just going to be an array of how about an array of strings. So we're going to do something like Apple, Sony, just some company names, Google, Microsoft. Let me copy and paste this. And the next one, I guess we can do numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do countries. Basically, what we're doing with this data is we're going to pass it into the other controller with a custom initializer, which is the first thing that we got up there. So instead of hard coding the data, we need to use some type of collection. So number of rows here is going to be data, the section position, and count. We also want number of sections, and we're going to return data.count. And for the actual label, we're going to go ahead and we're going to say this is data, the given section, and the given row position. So let's go ahead and set up that custom initializer. So it's quite simple, actually. So what you want to do is go ahead and just create an initializer on the other controller. In here, make sure you go ahead and call super init. And I recommend using this one with a nib name and bundle. Pass a nil for both of them. you'll see you get an error here where it's complaining that you need to bring in another required initializer. Go ahead and hit the error, hit fix, and it'll stub it out for you. You don't need to change any code with this, but every time you create a custom initializer on a view controller, you do in fact need to include this, and it'll just yell at you. You can hit the fix button. But if you hit Command B, everything's compiling now. So how do we actually pass in data? So let's say we want to pass in two things. Let's say we want to pass in selected item of type string, and we also want to pass in related items of type array of string. So what we can do in this initializer is we can simply say this and the second one, and before we call super init, we can say self.selected. Selected items is the inbound parameter of selected items, and self.related items is the inbound parameter of related items. Now, if you would Command B, you're going to see you have a build error. The reason you have a build error is here, we're trying to call this initializer without any parameters. That initializer no longer exists because we created our own. So we want to use this one now with a selected item and related items. So where do we get these values from? This is actually why we created the data array in this class. So we're going to say the model, rather we're going to say the items for this section is data index path dot section. So for related items, we can go ahead and pass in items. And for the selected items, it's items and the current thing that was selected in this collection. And that's how we can go ahead and pass in the data into this other view controller. Now, just for the sake of verifying, let's go ahead and let me do two things. So right now in the second controller, we're setting the title to custom controller. Let me actually move this down. But instead of that, let's go ahead and set the title to selected item dot uppercase. And on here, let's go ahead and just have one label, and we'll set the label text of that to be all of the related items. So let me create a label here, pretty simple label. We'll say the frame is the entirety of the controller. We're going to add it to the view. We're going to say label.text alignment is centered. We're going to say label.number of lines is -1. So it's going to be as many as we need to show the text. And finally, we're going to say for item in related items, label.text equals label.text plus a space plus the item. And that should be good to go. Let's see why this is complaining. Value of optional type string. So what we can say, because this is an optional type, we can say in parentheses here, if it's nil, go ahead and use an empty string like that. Hit Command B, things should be compiling. Hit Command R to build and run. And now you can see when we select on one of these, we do in fact get the related items. So these first things are companies here, but if we go to one of these down here, we get the different associated countries. Notice we don't have a title showing up here, and the reason for that is we're not wrapping this in the navigation controller. So go ahead and for this view controller presentation, create a navigation controller here and pass in the VC as a root controller. And you'll see when you select these now, the selected item is shown up here. So that's the approach of passing things in via an initializer. Moving on to the second one's fairly simple as well. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to start nesting these in a tab bar so we don't have to delete this code when I push it to GitHub. So go ahead and go to your main.storyboard and select this view controller. Come up here and in the toolbar, hit editor. And we are going to go to embed in as soon as I can find it. There it is. And we want to embed this in a tab bar controller like so. And we're just going to create 2 additional controllers in here for our 2 additional things that we're going to do. So let me just drag on to UI view controllers. So there is one. And we're gonna want one more. The only reason I'm using storyboard for this is for the sake of time, so we don't have to sit and design all that ourselves in code. And go ahead and drag from the tab bar controller to this guy. Relationship is view controller. Same from this guy, view controller. And we need two classes for those view controllers. So right click this, new file. You want a second view controller. And you want another one. Go ahead and call this third view controller. And I'm gonna select these and throw these into a folder so we know that these are the ones that are driving the tabs. So new group with selection. So we're gonna call this tab controllers. And just to make sure they show up, let's go ahead and set their background colors. We'll say this one is, as soon as it decides to give me the autocomplete. Interesting, it's not wanting to cooperate. So let me actually let's get rid of those commented out code. Let's get rid of this commented out code as well and go ahead and hit Command R. Let's just make sure they are popping up here. We should have two tabs or three tabs, two additional tabs, and they are in fact popping up here. Let's go ahead and try to get that background color to pop up again. There we go. Background color for this one will be yellow. And for this one, it's going to be, let's do blue. Awesome. Okay, the reason they're not showing up, the colors, is because we never set the class in the storyboard. So head to your storyboard, select the view controller, and on the right-hand panel here, go ahead and select this tab and give the class name you just created. So this one is second view controller. Be careful because we call the first one second custom. And this one is third view controller. So I apologize for so much setup, but it's pretty important to organize all of this so we can better understand what we're doing, but we now have all of the colors showing up. So let's talk about good old completion handlers for passing data. So I'm just gonna put a comment here, completion handler model. And what we're gonna do for this example is we're going to have a label on our view controller here. We're going to press a button that says enter text. On another controller, we're gonna enter in our name. And when we press done there, we're gonna basically pass the data back to this, and where the label is, we'll update it. And we're gonna do all of this through code, pretty similar in storyboard. So feel free to follow along with the storyboard as well. So firstly, let's make sure our autocomplete is working. So we want to label, this is going to be a UI label, and our autocomplete looks to be not cooperating. So let me go ahead and close Xcode and reopen it. Sometimes Xcode decides to make our lives more difficult. But if you close and reopen, your autocomplete should start working as expected again. So give it a second here. You can see the syntax highlighting also gets fixed when you reopen. Let's go ahead and create that UI label. Beautiful, it's working again. And this is going to be a label. We're going to say label.text alignment is going to be centered. Label.text is name : dash. And we're going to return the label. We want to add this onto the view. So we're going to say add subview for label. Now we also want to create a button so we can go and enter in text. So we're going to say let button is a UI button. Let's give it a frame. We'll go ahead and say 0, 0, 250. Let's go ahead and say view, add subview for the button. We're going to center the button. So we're going to say the button center is view.center. Whoops, view.center. Let's add some text on it. In this case, a title. We're going to say set name, normal. We're going to say button dot background color is going to be, I don't know, let's go black. And let's make sure we can see our title. So we'll make the title color white for normal. And we also want an action to occur when the button is tapped. So we're going to say button dot add target self did tap button. And the event is going to be touch up inside, which is a standard tap. Let's go ahead and create that function for did tap button. And before we continue along, let's go ahead and hit Command R and make sure our button and label is showing up. So let me actually make sure we're on the right simulator. Looks like Xcode likes to reset the simulator every time. Let's pick the iPhone 8 again and hit Command R. And give it a second. There it goes. Okay, cool. So we have our button showing up. Where is that label? So we never actually set a frame for the label. So let me say label.frame is a CG rect. Let's say 0, 50, the entirety of the width, and let's say 100. Let's hit run one more time. And we see our label appear now. So cool. So let's go ahead and show another controller and use a completion handler to get the data passed back. So I'm going to go ahead and create another controller. So right click, new file, Cocoa Touch class, and we're going to call this text entry view controller. And simply on here, we want to have a field and a way to essentially hit a done button to pass back the data. So for the done button, we're going to use a navigation item. We're going to present this controller in a navigation controller. So we'll say the right bar button item is a UI bar button item. And the title will be done. Style is done. Target is self. Action is did tap done button. Whoops. Let's go ahead and create this action right below it. The reason we need to put at Objective-C, if you're not familiar, is selectors are under the hood still in Objective-C, so we need to expose it in Swift. And let's see, let's give this a title of enter name. Now we want a text field on here, of course, so we're going to say field is a UI text field. And let's create it in an anonymous closure here. Let's say field dot placeholder. Placeholder is enter name. We'll say field dot background color. Whoops, let's get rid of my antivirus pop-up here. We'll say the background color is white, and that's probably good enough for this example. Let's make sure we add this as a subview. So add subview is field. And we also want to give this a frame. So let me go ahead and give it a CG rect of, let's say 20, 100, the width of the screen minus 40, so it's centered, and a width or a height of 55. And let's also pop up the keyboard on it by saying become first responder. So now on the other controller that's going to actually go ahead and present it, which is second view controller. When this button is tapped, let's go ahead and create the VC, which again is wrapped in a navigation controller with a root controller. The root controller will be the text entry controller. And finally, we can say present VC animated true. Go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. And when we go ahead and tap on this button here, we should see this other screen pop up. We've got our fields here. I always forget to set a background color, so let's come to this. Let's come to that other controller, which is this text entry. And let's set a background color on here of white. Like so. Go ahead and run. And hit that button again, and we see this other controller here, and we have this text field. We can enter in a name here, and looks like the text is going to be white default, so let's go ahead and change that as well. We'll say text color is going to be black, and let me actually make the background here a light gray. so we can see it better. And now we could actually work on passing the data back from that text entry controller to this controller. So cool, we get this popped up. We can enter in stuff in here. It's supposed to be black, I typed blue. And when we hit this, we want to pass it back. So how do we pass it back with a completion handler? It's actually quite simple. You create a closure on here called completion. It should be a var. You want to make sure it's public so people can assign to it other classes. And its type is going to be parameters that you want to send back. So in this case, we want to send a string back, string optional, because we might not have any text in the fields. And this closure returns void, and we may or may not have it, so optional. So now what we can do from the calling side, the presenting side, is as follows. First of all, we're gonna pull this out here, this text entry. We're gonna say the VC is text entry, like that. And on here, we can now say text entry dot completion. Go ahead and hit Command B to make sure the autocomplete now picks it up. Dot completion is text in. And this is how we can get the data back to this controller when this controller calls the completion block. So two things you want to be aware of. You always want to capture weak self so you don't cause a memory loop. Little out of scope for this video, but for our example's sake, we're going to update the labels text to be the text we get back. And also out of scope for this video, we want to make sure we do it on the main thread. So go ahead and wrap it in this dispatch queue main async. And then now on this text entry controller, what you can do is when the user taps the done button, we can call completion and pass in the fields.text. So let's go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. And you'll notice by default, this is name : dash. Let's open this up and let's type in some name. And as soon as we press this, one thing we forgot to do is dismiss this controller. Let's get rid of this dictation. We don't want that. But if we close this, we see that this is already updated. So let's add in that dismiss call. So when we tap that button, we also want to dismiss this view controller for text entry. So let's go ahead and hit this. We're going to type in, we're going to first say not now for the dictation that it keeps complaining about. And we're going to type in a name in here. We're going to hit this button. Let's make that go away again. Let's hit that button right there. And we see we dismiss the controller and also see the update here. Let's try some other text. We can just put in anything in here. And we see we successfully pass it back to this blue controller. Beautiful. The last thing we're going to do, this video has actually gotten way longer than I planned for, but the last thing we're going to do is use a notification center notification to basically pass some type of data to these other two controllers. So this one's quite simple, actually. Pretty simple, similar to the other two. We are going to have a button on here, and when we tap the button, we're going to basically fire off an event that this blue and table view controllers will be listening for. And when they receive that event, they're going to do stuff. In this case, we're going to go ahead on this one and remove the table and set the background to red. We'll also set the background to red here, and here we'll basically do nothing. So the point of a notification center event is you can pass any type of data. It could be a string, it could be a color, anything that you can wrap inside of the actual notification payload. So instead of talking about it, let me just write out the example. So we're going to create a button here. It's going to have a frame 0, 0, 250. We're going to say view, add subview, button. We're going to say button.center is view.center. Let's give this guy a background color of black or blue, I guess, for now. Button.setTitle is going to be fire event for normal. And what else do we want? We want the button title color to be white, normal, and most importantly, we want the button to have a target and an action. So did tab button for touch up inside. Let's go ahead and create that function here that gets called when we tap the button. Let's look at how to fire the notification. So firing a notification is very simple. You say notification center dot default, and you want to post a notification with a name and an object. You can also do it with user info, and user info you can use to pass in even more data to the receiver of the notification. Something important to note is notifications can be observed by n number of classes, so it's not a one-to-one communication of controllers. You can do one-to-many. So we're just going to use a name and an object. The name is going to be notification.name, and we're going to say our custom. So you can put whatever string in here that you want. And an object is going to be basically anything you want. So we're going to pass in a dictionary, and this is going to be a dictionary of a string and a color. So we're going to say UI color dot red. And the receiver is basically going to pull this color out and assign its view controller's view to it. So simple enough. How do we actually go about listening for this notification? So pretty simple. In the other two view controllers, in view did load, we are going to say underscore equals notification center default. Whoops, let's type in default correctly. Default, and we want to add an observer. And the one that we're going to go with, you can either go with this one, which returns a pointer to the observer, or this one, which calls a function. I recommend this one for a variety of reasons, but let's go ahead and paste in our notification name here. The second parameter you can say is nil. The thread you want to call this on is main, since we're going to update the user interface. And this is a closure in which the notification gets passed directly, and you can do this. Let's go ahead and change this underscore to be an observer, and the type of this observer is supposed to be a NS object protocol optional. And once we basically get the notification in here, we want to get the object out. So we're going to say guard let object is notification dot object, and we want to cast it as a dictionary of string and UI color. Else we're going to return. Then what we want to do is we want to say guard let color is going to be object for the key color. Else we are again going to return. And finally, if we get that color out, we're going to say self dot view dot background color is color. And in this controller, we're also going to hide the table. We'll say is hidden is true. I'm going to copy and paste this to the second view controller, and we'll review this in a moment since there's a lot of code typing pretty fast. So let's go ahead and paste that in here. Whoops, we want to paste in a view did load actually, which is this function right here. And let's get rid of this table view call since there's no table view here. And let me create this observer variable in here as well. And as object protocol. Go ahead and hit Command B and Command R, make sure it runs. If it does, great. Let's see if it works. So we're gonna hit this button. Notice these screens are blue and black respectively. So we hit this. This screen is now red, and this one, the table is hidden and it is also now red. So let's go over that one more time. So on this third view controller, we have this button, pretty simple. When we call the button, we post a notification with this name, and the object in our case is a dictionary. The key is a string, and the value is the color red. In the other two controllers, what we're doing is we set an observer. The type of an observer to hold on to it is this NS object protocol. And the observer is saying, observe for this notification. This object is not the same as what you expect back, so we pass in nil. We actually get the notification in the closure here, and then we unwrap it. We make sure we have an object. We then try to get the color for the key color in the dictionary. We assign it to the view's background color, and in this case, we get rid of the table. And then basically the exact same thing here, and the only difference is there's no table, so we just dropped that bit of the code. And that's how you can use a notification center post. And there you have it. That's basically the top 3 ways of passing data between different view controllers. Whether you want to do one to another using a custom initializer, which is what we've got going on right here. Let me close this for some more room. So we created a custom initializer in this second custom controller, and we can pass in data. You can, of course, use a completion handler, which is what we are doing here on this text entry controller, where the user hits done, and we call this completion closure, which gets the data back to this controller. Or third, you can post notifications to pass data to all the observers. So this video has gone pretty long. I wanted to make sure that we got through all the explanations thoroughly. The last thing I'll end up wrapping up with is best practices. So notifications should really only be used where you really have a case of passing data to multiple observers. You shouldn't be firing off notifications that are only meant for one observer. For the case of custom initializers, this is very popular, and you should definitely use this if you want to pass in any data that's a requirement to a controller. Very simple to set up. Completion handlers, I would say, is the second most common, and this is often used when you have asynchronous tasks. So for example, let's say the user needs to do some work on another controller and you want to get the result back. In this case, we're entering text. A completion handler is by far the simplest and more straightforward way to set this up. So that's about it. So if you haven't destroyed the like button already, make sure to do so for that YouTube algorithm. Helps the video and channel quite a bit. Comment any questions, concerns, suggestions, feedback. I love hearing from all of you guys. Hit subscribe if you're a returning viewer or if you enjoyed this video for daily Swift uploads. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one.